What are some jobs, professions that existed in history but don't exist now? Organ pumpers. Until the organ blower came along, organs had to be pumped by hand. Clergy would send sextons and altar boys up to the loft to hand pump the organ for services. Today, the organ blower gets turned on with the push of a button and supplies ample wind for the reservoirs and pipes. Didn't the guy who invented the automatic switchboard get annoyed because his competitor's wife worked in the switchboard and kept directing business calls to her husband? He found out and then invented the automatic switchboard. Imagine being so pissed off you destroy an entire job in multiple countries. My aunt worked the phone switchboard for 30 years and retired from Bell Telephone. She connected people with those old cables like in the movies. She said people would call just to chit-chat too. My hometown was in the middle of nowhere country. She retired in the late 70s because the technology finally automated it. I think my hometown still had that old tech as late as 1978. For a while before modern refrigeration, ice delivery was a pretty big profession that employed a lot of people. Ice harvesting was dangerous too. A small army of people would essentially walk on a frozen lake in the early morning and literally chop out blocks of ice, almost Minecraft style, and load them onto trucks to be delivered to homes and businesses. Granted, there's still ice delivery and such, but modern refrigeration did away with the whole risk life on a frozen lake aspect of it, not to mention the ability to just, make ice in the freezer. Door closers. The Paris Opera House had these people whose only function was to make sure doors were always closed, avoiding air currents that could damage the singer's voice. In reality, they just wanted to give people who had worked there for long and were already too old to do anything else a job so they could earn a bit of a living. Oh, I forget this sometimes. Photo development is mostly gone now, too. I worked at a Walmart in a small town in '09 and one of the older employees used to run the photo department and knew how to develop film. By the time I started working there, the photo department was downsized to a couple employees. I don't even remember if they developed film. I'm pretty sure they just printed from digital photos and shipped film to get developed off-site. Rome was a social place, full of well-to-do people. So many people, in fact, that you couldn't possibly remember all of their names. Thankfully, you can avoid an embarrassing incident by bringing a nomenclator. With your trusty nomenclator by your side, anyone who comes within 5 feet of you or makes eye contact will have their name loudly announced so you can't possibly forget. I write historical fiction, so I've come across quite a few of these. Some that haven't been mentioned yet. Lectors. Pre-radio, some workplaces had a lecturer who would read out newspaper articles, books, or just tell stories to entertain manual workers. See sponge harvesters. Weighing themselves down, these people would dive up to 30 feet down, without breathing apparatus, to harvest sea sponges. Sea sponges had a range of uses. Two of the less well-known are: 1, encased in a fun net and tied with a string. Ladies use these during their monthly choruses, or periods. They're so absorbent that some escorts still use them so they don't have to take 1 week off per month. 2, dipped in a range of substances such as vinegar, oil, or special tinctures. They were used in a similar fashion but as a form of birth control. The substances they were dipped in were thought to be spermicides, but it's likely they worked only as a barrier method. Aircraft listener. Pre-radar, they made sort of gigantic ear trumpets, like hard of hearing people used to help them hear before hearing aids, and actual people sat and listened for sounds of approaching aircraft so they could sound an early warning. Resurrectionists. As medical science progressed, access to bodies to study anatomy did not. People did not want to be dissected after death and no one left their body to science. Doctors were given the bodies of hanged criminals to study, but this generally was not enough. Indeed, when half-hanged Ewan MacDonald awoke on the dissectionist's table, a young doctor bludgeoned him to death because he feared losing his chance to dissect a real human. I guess first do no harm doesn't apply if you really want to cut someone up. Anyway, resurrectionists dug up the recently buried and sold the bodies to doctors and medical schools. Legally no one owned dead bodies, so it wasn't against the law. Many went to great lengths to ensure they could not be dug up, such as being buried under cement or stone slabs, or encased in iron cages known as marzifs. Some resurrectionists, of course, took it too far and began killing people, the most famous case being Burke and Hare. The profession, if it can be called that, slowly died out when doctors were given access to first, the bodies of paupers who couldn't afford a funeral, but the real death knell was when workhouses became a thing and doctors were allowed to dissect their dead. There's a colony of Haneo women on Jeju Island, South Korea who still dive for seaweed, mollusks, etc. As freedivers, they are incredibly badass. There are still navigators on some Air Force aircraft, though their mission and duties have changed dramatically due to technological advancements and aircraft upgrades. They are sort of the inverse of aircraft listener. Astronomer here. To expand on this, at the turn of the 20th century, the Harvard computers were a group of exceptional women who were hired to basically catalog all the new photographic images of the sky taken by Harvard Observatory male astronomers. It was thought unseemly for women to stay up all night at the telescope, to look for new things but also catalog things like variable stars. The incredible thing was these women ended up really driving the transition for astronomy from a let's look at the sky and catalog stuff in a discipline to a let's figure out the physics that drives the universe one. Along the way they discovered how the hard-rigid spectral lines change for different types of stars, paving the way for stellar classification. That binary stars exist where the two stars are so close to each other you can't split the two by eye. The majority of such stars today, Cepheid variables, which were the first independent way to calculate distance, late used by Hubble to discover the distance to the Andromeda galaxy, and that our universe was bigger than just our own Milky Way as people had assumed. So many new nebulae, galaxies, stars, etc. My personal favorite, however, is a supernova, SN 1895b, discovered in 1985 by computer William Meta Fleming, mainly because during my PhD thesis I relied on her discovery to take late-time observations of this object a century later and make constraints on the original explosion. Good science could never dies. Smile. William Fleming BTW was a single mom immigrant who was the maid of the observatory director at the time, who was famously frustrated by the work of his male graduate students and famously complained my maid could do better, and hired her as a computer. She then ended up running the group, and had a correspondence and friendship with Andrew Carnegie's wife, the richest man in the world at the time. Oh, also as an aside, two of the computers who made some of these amazing discoveries possible were also deaf. Fun fact, I'm now a postdoc in the very same institute and my office is just a few hundred feet from where the computers worked. My favorite detail is their building is filled with giant glass windows. We think we are hotshots today, but back then there was no electricity, so you'd pore over the images only during daylight. Sorry to go on about this, I just think the computers are amazing and deserve to be known more than they are. Many buildings in NYC still have an elevator operator, particularly buildings with a lot of Jewish residents, who do not press the buttons themselves when observing the Shabbat. Often, these people are only employed from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, and are just average-looking people in street clothes, rather than the fancy dude with a hat that you might imagine from a Wes Anderson movie. Garden hermit. During Victorian times it was fashionable to have a hermit living in your garden. They were meant to dress in robes and hang out. Sometimes they would tell stories or history to visitors, but part of being a hermit if not hanging out around people, so, for the most part, they just existed. https://www.atlasobscura.com/articles/the history of hermits and gardens. Resurrection men aka body snatchers stole bodies of the recently dead and sold them to medical colleges so that students could learn anatomy. Families trying to prevent such fate of their dead family members would guard their kin's grave, tomb or hire someone to do that. Also a job that I would guess is no longer around. guarding the grave of the dead until they are too rotten to be stolen. https://allocation.com/humanities/resurrectionists body snatching in 19th century Britain. Surprised this hasn't been mentioned yet, but scribes, before the printing press, if you wanted a book, you had to have it made by a scribe. So some dude would have to spend hundreds of hours meticulously copying a book in minute detail in order for you to have a copy. So back then being able to read was basically the status symbol equivalent of owning a yacht/private jet today, or just being a priest. In the Muslim world, the profession of scribe was inseparable from the great art of calligraphy, which many would consider the most developed Arab visual art. The printing press was heavily opposed by scribes in the Ottoman Empire, which was part of the reason why Arabic printing presses were banned. It's fair to say that calligraphy has stagnated a lot since then, but it's having a resurgence now, so that's great. My grandmother was a corsettier. A corsettier was a specialist in women's undergarments back in the day when women's undergarments were much more utilitarian. She worked in a nice department store measuring women and helping them select garters, corsets, girdles, bras and stockings. This was in the 1950 to 1960s, and while we do still have ladies who work in the lingerie section of certain stores, none of them are as specialized as corsettiers. And my grandmother tell you that, like she told us the same thing almost every time we went shopping for all of her 96 years of life. My parents, who are boomers, explained that one of them had thought of getting a job as a soda jerk. It was like a bartender but with non-alcoholic carbonated drinks, sometimes called dry bars. Milkshakes and frappe were also served. Here in New England, milkshakes don't contain ice cream. Get your mind out of the gutter. Jerk comes from operating the faucets. I get it on it can be mistaken for masturbation. Jerk is a form of movement that is mostly suddenly. If you see most Avon, you get the idea. When the soda fountain improved and allowed the option of multi-drinks or even self-serve, the job of a soda jerk became a novelty. I have only seen such a bar often attending stadium events. Yet, the way the soda or similar drinks are pulled in is similar to a sprayer you see in someone's sink. Edit, copy edits. Key punch operators. In the old days of mainframe computers, new data was entered, somehow, by punching holes in little cards that would be fed into a slot in a computer. The job was becoming extinct around the time I was finishing high school, so I don't understand how punching holes in cards conveyed information to computers, but I do remember seeing classified ads in the newspaper advertising positions for key punch operators. My grandmother once remarked that she'd been told, probably ca. 1950, that if you could operate a key punch machine, you had a job for life. Punch cards were useful for both data entry and portable external storage. They are crude by our standards, but what they replaced was stuff like flipping a bunch of switches to enter a single number or manually wiring up a circuit board to program a computer. My great-grandfather ran one of the last livery stables in our area. He provided all kinds of services related to horses and wagons. He would board horses, rent mules, rent wagons, haul freight and passengers, etc. He had a big wagon with seats that could flip down, allowing it to be multi-purpose. When cars and trucks took over in the 1920s, he switched to farming. In Japan, there are quite a few functions that aren't really necessary, but still have staff, like a dude pressing the buttons in elevators in high-end department stores or old dudes standing around road maintenance work with fluorescent sticks, ostensibly directing traffic away from the maintenance work. Only there aren't really any cars on the road anyway, and you can clearly see that half the road is blocked. I quite like it, though. I got to kind of know this old fluorescent stick guy I'd always pass every morning. Traffic directing cops. They stood in booths and acted as traffic lights way back in the early 20th century. A few others from the Victorian era were the coalmen who shoveled coal into your basement through a small door, the sewing lady who came once a month or so to help with sewing projects, and street cleaners, not the machines, who swept the streets clean of either horse dung or early car exhaust. Flint knappers. Flint was used in some form or other for tools for 2 million years, from a time before humans left Africa right up until the 20th century, when the last gun flint makers stopped trading. That being said, there are some lithic blade makers around. Some surgeons still like to use obsidian knives. Train firemen. They stood next to the engineers in the cabs of steam locomotives, shoveling coal into the boiler as needed. They also served as the engineer's eyes on that side of the train. After the switch over to diesel locomotives, they were often still in the cab because the union contract required they be, but they had nothing to do. There was no need for any equivalent to them on modern trains. My great-grandfather ran one of the last livery stables in our area. He provided all kinds of services related to horses and wagons. He would board horses, rent mules, rent wagons, haul freight and passengers, etc. He had a big wagon with seats that could flip down, allowing it to be multi-purpose. When cars and trucks took over in the 1920s, he switched to farming. Castratos were classical male singers, equivalent to sopranos, mezzo-sopranos, etc., who were castrated before reaching puberty. Therefore, when they sing as adults, they will continue to have that high-pitched tone that they had when they were boys. The practice was purposely diminished by the late 1800s. You can find the recording of one castrato named Alessandro Morschi on YouTube. My town is actually famous for collecting a lot of their inhabitants' urine. We originally produced a lot of textiles, especially wool, for the country, and urine was used to wash wool and get rid of any fat due to the ammonia and the urine, but it was also used to dye wool fabrics. People used to collect their urine in pots and get paid a bit of money when they were full and collected. It's a bit of a weird story, but it's my heritage and I immediately thought of this. Chimney sweep apprentice. Also known as climbing boys. Little kids that used to get shoved in a chimney to clean it, usually bought from poor families or orphanages and used for labor. Sometimes to encourage them to work fast, they would burn straw in the fireplace. Needless to say, the job was super dangerous and don't exist anymore. Professional mourning. In many ancient cultures, you could hire mourners for your loved one's funeral to really add extra drama and sadness. They could also give eulogies or comfort and entertain grieving family. Also, apparently there was a time when wealthy people would hire hermits to live in their gardens, and act as part gardener and part wise old sage they could go to for advice. Rush bearer. In the Middle Ages, many churches and castles had bare earth or stone floors. It was the practice to weave massive sweet flag, mistakenly called rushes, which were layered onto the floor to warm the floor, cushion it, hold down unpleasant odors, prevent people from walking through all kinds of hacked-up nastiness. It was the custom to spit on the floor, and prevent insects from crawling up onto people's clothing. The people who brought the rushes in and laid them were the rush bearers. I heard in the 1800s alcoholism was so rampant they used to hire people to take horse-drawn wagons through the streets in the early morning to round up passed-out drunks and toss them in the wagon. This had to be done because sometimes there was so many of them they would block the streets. The wagons would take the drunks back to their own neighborhoods or someplace out of the way. I saw in one documentary that explained what inspired prohibition that these wagons drivers would just toss the drunks into a river to wake them up and send them on their way. Blacksmiths. They still exist, but it isn't nearly as widespread. For the uneducated, they are metal workers. They put a piece of steel in a fire, pull it out, and then put it on an anvil before beating the shit out of it with a hammer. There is a lot more to it, but that is the very basics of it. I recommend watching Forged in Fire if you're interested. Night soil man is a repulsive, undignified, obsolete profession of entering the communal cesspit and collecting the accumulation of human excrements before the advent of modern sewage systems. The primitive privies were crude hunts to preserve modesty in a hole that was frequented by entire streets of people, Unscrupulous landlords are an immutable attribute of Britain's accommodations, and they always permitted amenities to become dilapidated due to extortionate costs of maintenance. Night soil men often deigned to enter denominated cesspits to extricate the grotesque blockages and impede the transmission of cholera. I cannot fathom how malodorous it was.